It arrived on a Tuesday, tucked neatly into the mail slot like a venomous serpent disguised as a polite invitation. Not a letter, not a friendly reminder, but an official violation notice from the Sterling Meadows Homeowners Association. Jane, a woman whose hands were more accustomed to soil than corporate memos, stared at the crisp white paper, her brow furrowing with a mixture of confusion and burgeoning annoyance. The headline screamed in bold, "Non-compliance, landscape maintenance, and aesthetics." Below it, a clinical, almost insulting description of her haven. Your property at 47 Maple Drive exhibits an unsightly overgrowth of various flora, creating an unkempt and visually disruptive presence within the community. Specifically, the proliferation of non-traditional plant species and lack of manicured uniformity violates Articles 7b and 9d of the Sterling Meadows Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions. Jane's gaze drifted from the sterile text to the vibrant riot of green and color just beyond her window, her garden. It wasn't manicured, no. It was a joyful, sprawling tapestry of native wildflowers, buzzing with bees, fluttering with butterflies, a micro-ecosystem humming with life. To her, it was perfect, a personal rebellion against the sterile golf course uniformity that defined the rest of Sterling Meadows. She'd spent the last 3 years meticulously cultivating it, transforming a barren patch of lawn into a thriving sanctuary. Every morning, she'd step out, coffee in hand, greeted by the chorus of crickets and the sight of new blooms unfurling. The cone flowers stood tall, proud in their purple glory. The milkweed, a lifeline for monarch butterflies, stretched towards the sun. Goldenrod spilled over the edges, a cascade of sunshine. This wasn't overgrowth, it was life. This wasn't unsightly, it was a testament to nature's untamed beauty, a stark contrast to the identical, weed-sprayed lawns that mirrored each other down every cul-de-sac. She loved the way the morning dew clung to the spiderwebs between the leaves, how the cardinal bathed in the shallow bird bath she'd built from reclaimed stone, and the gentle hum of activity that underscored the quiet mornings. Her garden was an extension of herself, wild, resilient, and deeply connected to the natural world. It was her escape from the mundane, her artistic expression, and her quiet act of defiance against the very notion of perfectly manicured. The notice continued, detailing penalties. Failure to rectify this violation within 30 days will result in a fine of 100 Ruhr, escalating to 50 Hausen per week thereafter until compliance is achieved. Further inaction may lead to legal remedies, including forced remediation at the homeowner's expense. A cold dread initially twisted in Jane's stomach, quickly replaced by a hot wave of indignation. Forced remediation? Her garden? Her sanctuary? The audacity of it all was breathtaking. She could almost picture Brenda Albright, the HOA president, a woman whose perfectly coiffed hair and perpetually pursed lips seemed to embody the very essence of rigid conformity, clucking disapprovingly at the sight of a stray leaf. Brenda probably saw butterflies as untidy airborne litter. The thought ignited a slow-burning fire within Jane. She crumpled the notice in her hand, then smoothed it out again. She needed to understand every word, every threat. This wasn't just about a garden anymore. It was about principle. It was about challenging the arbitrary power of a group that dictated the very aesthetics of private lives. They wanted uniformity. They wanted control. Jane felt a quiet, simmering resolve. She had always been a peace-loving individual, someone who preferred quiet contemplation to confrontation. But this felt different. This felt personal. Her garden was her spirit, and they were trying to prune it into submission. A faint smile touched her lips, a dangerous glint in her eyes. They wanted her to remove her ugly garden? Oh, she would remove it, but not in the way they imagined. She would transform it into something they couldn't touch, something they would have no choice but to acknowledge. The Sterling Meadows HOA had just made a formidable enemy, and they didn't even know it. This was far from over. The crumpled violation notice, now smoothed and meticulously highlighted, became Jane's roadmap to war. The initial sting of indignation had sharpened into a focused, almost obsessive determination. She spent the next few days in a blur of furious activity, fueled by lukewarm coffee and the unwavering conviction that her garden was worth fighting for. Her kitchen table, usually cluttered with seed packets and gardening tools, was transformed into a command center, buried under printouts, legal pads, and a laptop glowing late into the night. She started with the Sterling Meadows covenants, conditions, and restrictions, the very document the HOA cited. It was a thick, poorly organized tome of legalese, filled with clauses about fence heights, paint colors, and acceptable lawn lengths. Jane scoured it, highlighter in hand, initially seeking any ambiguity, any obscure paragraph that might grant her an exception. Pages blurred into an endless recitation of must maintain, shall conform, and prohibited if deemed unsightly. It was disheartening, a bureaucratic labyrinth designed to stifle individuality. The more she read, the more the HOA's stance seemed ironclad, built on a foundation of aesthetic conformity and strict adherence to suburban norms. Her wild, vibrant garden simply didn't fit their sterile mold. But Jane was a gardener, and gardeners understood perseverance. They knew that even in the toughest soil, life found a way. If the HOA bylaws were a brick wall, she wouldn't try to bash through it. She'd look for the cracks, the overlooked spaces where something new could take root. She broadened her search, moving from HOA specifics to municipal codes. The city of Sterling Meadows had its own set of ordinances regarding property maintenance, but these too seemed to prioritize neatness over biodiversity. There were mentions of weed abatement and nuisance vegetation, phrases that, to Jane, felt like direct attacks on her beloved goldenrod and milkweed. She downloaded PDF after PDF, her printer whirring late into the night, spewing out page after page of dense text. Her eyes were tired, but her mind was alight with a new kind of energy, the thrill of the chase, the intellectual challenge of finding a weakness in the system. Then she stumbled upon something promising. A local, environmental conservation website, almost by accident while searching for information on native plant benefits. It wasn't directly about HOAs, but it discussed the increasing push for environmental sustainability and biodiversity, even in suburban areas. It mentioned federal and state initiatives to protect native ecosystems and promote pollinator habitats. A tiny spark flickered in her mind. Could there be a higher law, a broader principle that superseded the narrow vision of the Sterling Meadows HOA? This led her down an entirely new rabbit hole. She started researching state-level environmental protection acts, federal wildlife, conservation statutes, and even local government resolutions on biodiversity. The language was even denser, full of legal jargon and complex scientific terms, but a pattern began to emerge. Many states, especially those with a strong focus on conservation, had laws or policies encouraging the use of native plants, discouraging the destruction of pollinator habitats, and sometimes even offering legal protections for landowners who actively cultivated such spaces. She spent hours on government websites, in digital archives of legal documents, and even reached out to a local university's environmental law department, though her email asking for advice was too vague to get a detailed response. One evening, bleary-eyed and surrounded by stacks of paper, a specific phrase from a state environmental statute jumped out at her. Any naturalized indigenous plant community established for the purpose of promoting biodiversity and ecological health shall be protected from undue interference, provided it does not pose a direct and demonstrable threat to public health or safety. Her heart gave a jolt. Undue interference. Protected. This was it. This was the crack in the wall. This wasn't just about planting pretty flowers. It was about establishing an ecological sanctuary. If her garden wasn't just a collection of unsightly weeds, but a formally established native species sanctuary that contributed to local biodiversity, then the HOA's demands might constitute undue interference. The realization hit her with the force of a sudden downpour after a long drought. A giddy, almost maniacal laugh escaped her lips. This wasn't merely a loophole, it was a cannon through their meticulously crafted, suffocating bylaws. The HOA's entire argument rested on aesthetics, on subjective notions of neatness. But if her garden served a crucial ecological function, a function protected by state law, then their aesthetic demands became irrelevant, even unlawful. The sheer brilliance of it, the poetic justice, sent a thrill coursing through her. They wanted her to remove her garden. She would make it something they were legally forbidden to touch. The next steps were immediate and precise. She needed to verify the specific native species in her garden that qualified for protection under state and federal guidelines. She researched local nurseries specializing in native plants, specifically looking for certified sources. She started a meticulous log, documenting every species, its ecological benefits, and its indigenous status. She even found information on applying for a formal pollinator habitat certification from a reputable nonprofit organization, a move that would provide an official, undeniable stamp of legitimacy to her garden. The excitement was palpable. Gone was the bitter frustration. In its place, a cool, strategic exhilaration. She was no longer just a gardener defending her patch. She was a quiet warrior, armed with knowledge and the undeniable power of nature. She discreetly ordered a few more certified native plant varieties online, species known to attract specific, struggling pollinator populations. She already had many of them, but having a documented record of their origin and purpose would be crucial. She also began taking detailed photographs of her garden, documenting the insects, birds, and small animals it attracted. Every buzzing bee, every fluttering butterfly was now a witness, a tiny soldier in her green army. The HOA might have started this fight, but Jane was determined to finish it, not just for her garden, but for the principle of a wilder, more beautiful world. The game had changed. The garden became Jane's canvas, her battlefield. Armed with a deeper understanding of ecological principles and the legal backing she'd unearthed, she embarked on a strategic transformation. It wasn't about ripping everything out and starting anew. It was about enhancing, about legitimizing, about making her wild patch irrefutably a protected native species sanctuary. She meticulously labeled every plant, creating small, almost invisible markers that identified species by their Latin names and ecological benefits. She carefully integrated the newly acquired certified native plants, weaving them into the existing tapestry of her garden. Coneflowers were joined by asters. Milkweed expanded its territory alongside bluestem grass, and the ground cover thickened with wild ginger. Each addition was a silent, defiant brick in her legal fortress. She installed a discreet, tastefully designed sign, hand-painted by herself, proclaiming Certified Pollinator Habitat and Native Species Sanctuary. It was a polite declaration of war. As Jane meticulously cultivated her sanctuary, the Sterling Meadows HOA, particularly Brenda Albright, escalated their campaign. The initial polite notices turned into a relentless barrage of increasingly aggressive correspondence. First came the certified letters, demanding immediate compliance and threatening escalating fines. 150 drodramas for the first week, 75 ruasers for every subsequent week. Each letter was a carbon copy of the last, cold and impersonal, yet dripping, with a condescending tone that implied Jane was a delinquent child. Jane would read them, a faint, almost amused smile playing on her lips, then calmly file them away, knowing each one was another piece of evidence for her inevitable defense. Then came the phone calls. numerous at inconvenient times, from numbers she didn't recognize. When she occasionally answered, it was typically an exasperated voice from the HOA management company, repeating the same tired lines about community standards and property values. Jane, however, had mastered the art of polite but firm dismissal. "Thank you for your concern," she'd say, her voice calm as a summer breeze. "But my garden is a certified native species sanctuary, protected under, mention your specific state environmental code here, e.g., California State Law, Mirror 123.45. I believe you'll find everything is in full compliance with relevant environmental statutes." The line on the other end would usually go silent, a pause of confused sputtering, before they hung up. She knew she was hitting a nerve. The HOAs. Frustration morphed into outright aggression. They sent a letter threatening legal action for persistent non-compliance and nuisance behavior. This was followed by a chilling notice of a mandatory property inspection. They intended to send a delegation, including Brenda Albright herself, to survey the damage and officially document the alleged violations. Jane, anticipating this, simply made sure her sanctuary was at its peak, humming with pollinators, each plant identifiable and thriving. She even set up a small camera to record their visit, not for confrontation, but for documentation. The day of the inspection arrived. Brenda Albright, flanked by two equally stiff-backed HOA board members, marched up Jane's driveway, their expressions a mix of grim determination and barely concealed disdain. Brenda's eyes narrowed as she took in the riot of color and life that was Jane's garden, a stark contrast to the perfectly trimmed hedges and barren lawns of the surrounding houses. "Miss Miller," Brenda began, her voice brittle with controlled anger, "this is simply unacceptable. We warned you. This is an eyesore. It devalues the entire neighborhood." Jane emerged from her front door, calm and composed, a slight, almost imperceptible smirk on her face. "Good morning, Brenda," she replied, her voice soft but steady. "Welcome to the Sterling Meadows Native Species Sanctuary." She gestured expansively towards the garden. "As you can see, the monarch caterpillars are thriving on the milkweed, the bees are very busy with the coneflowers, and the goldfinches simply adore the sunflower seeds." Brenda's jaw tightened. "Sanctuary? This is a derelict patch of weeds, and those little signs you've put up mean nothing. They're a childish protest." One of the other board members, a portly man named Mr. Henderson, sniffed disdainfully. "Looks like a fire hazard to me, Miss Miller, and quite frankly, rather unkempt." Jane merely smiled, her gaze unwavering. "On the contrary, Mr. Henderson, this is a meticulously cultivated habitat, and each of these little signs indicates a certified native plant, protected under state environmental code. I have all the documentation, including certification from the National Wildlife Federation for this official pollinator habitat." She paused, letting the words hang in the air. Any attempts to remove or interfere with these protected species would, unfortunately, be a violation of state law. A flicker of uncertainty crossed Brenda's face, quickly masked by a scowl. "This is a private homeowners association, Ms. Miller. Our covenants supersede any frivolous environmental claims." Her voice trailed off, a hint of doubt creeping in. They tried to move closer to inspect, to find something, anything, they could point to as an actual, undeniable violation. But Jane had been thorough. There was no trash, no dead plants, no actual nuisance beyond their subjective dislike of its wild beauty. The paths were clear, the edges defined, even if the plants within were exuberantly free. Jane watched their faces, the shift from indignation to confusion, then to a dawning, unwelcome realization. They were trapped. Their rigid rules, designed to enforce conformity, were clashing with a higher, broader authority. The tension was palpable, a silent standoff between manicured lawns and wild, untamed life. Jane maintained her composed demeanor, the quiet triumph simmering beneath her surface. She knew with absolute certainty that her ugly garden was now legally impenetrable, and the HOA, fuming and frustrated, had no idea how to proceed. This garden wasn't just thriving, it was a carefully constructed legal fortress, and they were about to hit its walls. The atmosphere in the Sterling Meadows Community Center's main hall was thick with unspoken tension, a low hum of hushed conversations punctuated by the clinking of plastic chairs. Tonight was the quarterly HOA meeting, but everyone knew it was primarily about one thing: Jane Miller and her wild garden. Word had spread like wildfire after Brenda Albright's humiliating inspection, and the room was packed, far more so than usual. Residents leaned forward whispering, their eyes flickering between the stern-faced HOA board members seated at the head table and Jane, who sat calmly in the second row, clutching a slim, professional-looking binder. Brenda Albright called the meeting to order, her voice sharper than usual. She started with the usual pleasantries, the landscaping updates, the new pool rules, all met with impatient fidgeting. Then she cleared her throat, adjusting her perfectly ironed blazer. "Now, to the matter of property, 47 Maple Drive," she announced, her gaze sweeping over the room, attempting to project authority. Despite repeated warnings and escalating fines, the homeowner, Ms. Jane Miller, has failed to bring her landscape into compliance with Sterling Meadows covenants. "We have exhausted all amicable solutions, and as such, the board has authorized legal proceedings to ensure immediate remediation and recoup outstanding fines." A murmur rippled through the room. Some residents exchanged worried glances. Others nodded in approval, seemingly aligning with the HOA's stance on uniformity. Brenda motioned towards a projector screen, displaying blurred, unflattering photos of Jane's garden, carefully selected to highlight its overgrowth and untidiness. "As you can see," Brenda stated, her voice laced with triumph, "this is an unacceptable visual blight. It compromises our property values and the aesthetic integrity of our esteemed community." Then it was Jane's turn. Brenda, with a dismissive wave, said, "Ms. Miller, do you have anything to add before we proceed with the vote to initiate legal action?" The phrasing was meant to be condescending, to imply her input was a mere formality before the inevitable. Jane rose, her movements unhurried. She walked to the podium, her steps confident, her gaze steady. There was no defiance in her posture, just quiet resolve. The room fell silent. She didn't start with an emotional plea. Instead, she opened her binder. "Thank you, Brenda, and thank you, esteemed members of the Sterling Meadows Homeowners Association, for allowing me to clarify the situation regarding my property." Her voice was clear, calm, and carried easily through the room. "For months, I have received various notices regarding the perceived non-compliance of my garden. I understand the HOA's desire for aesthetic consistency. However," she paused, letting her words sink in, "I must respectfully inform the board and the community that my garden at 47 Maple Drive is no longer merely a personal landscape. It is a certified native species sanctuary, officially recognized by the mention a credible but fictional National State Environmental Organization, e.g., National Pollinator Partnership, and operating under the full protection of your state's environmental code, e.g., Florida Statute 581-2185, the Florida Native Plant Protection Act of 1999, and Federal Migratory Bird Treaty Act provisions." A collective gasp went through the room. The murmurs erupted again, this time louder, confused. Brenda Albright's face, usually so composed, fractured into a mask of stunned disbelief. Mr. Henderson, the portly board member, spluttered, "What nonsense is this? Certified what?" Jane held up a laminated certificate. "This is the official certification. It states that my property provides a crucial habitat for endangered pollinators, monarch butterflies, and indigenous bird species. The plants in my garden are not weeds or overgrowth. They are carefully selected, certified native flora essential for our local ecosystem's health and biodiversity. She then projected a series of stunning, professional-quality photographs onto the screen. Not the HOA's grainy images, but vibrant close-up shots of buzzing bees, iridescent hummingbirds, and delicate monarch caterpillars feeding on the milkweed. The contrast was startling. The eyesore now looked like a living, breathing work of art. Furthermore, Jane continued, her voice gaining a quiet authority, the State Environmental Code clearly states, in Section 7b, subsection 3, that no Homeowners Association or similar entity shall prohibit or unreasonably restrict the establishment or maintenance of native plant landscapes that contribute to ecological restoration or conservation efforts, provided such landscapes comply with health and safety standards. She projected the exact legal text onto the screen, clear for everyone to see. My garden, as a certified sanctuary, meets all health and safety standards. It does not obstruct walkways, it does not harbor pests. In fact, it attracts beneficial insects that naturally control mosquito populations, and it poses no fire hazard. Therefore, any attempt by the HOA to demand its removal or impose fines would be a direct violation of state law, subjecting the HOA to significant penalties and potential legal action from state environmental agencies. The hall erupted. Residents were whispering, some openly gasping. The mood had shifted dramatically. Looks of confusion turned to dawning understanding, then to expressions of awe and grudging respect for Jane. Brenda Albright looked as if she'd been slapped. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with shock. She tried to interrupt. "This is preposterous. We were not informed of any such—" Jane calmly cut her off. "I provided detailed legal citations in my responses to your notices dated, mention dates of past notices. I even mentioned the protected status during your property inspection on mention inspection date. Perhaps the information was overlooked." This landed a direct hit. The accusation of incompetence hung heavy in the air. Mr. Peterson, another board member, a retired lawyer known for his meticulousness, quickly pulled out his phone and started typing, his expression grim. He was clearly looking up the statute. As he scrolled, his face visibly drained of color. He looked up, catching Brenda's eye, and gave a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of his head, the universal sign of, "We're screwed." "The fines you have levied," Jane continued, her voice unwavering, "are also illegal. I have meticulously documented all correspondence, all notices, and all certified receipts for my native plant purchases, along with proof of my sanctuary certification. Should this matter proceed to court, I am confident that the HOA would not only be forced to rescind all fines and demands, but would also be liable for my legal costs and, potentially, face investigations from state environmental protection bodies for violating their statutes." A woman in the front row, Mrs. Gable, known for her staunch HOA loyalty, slowly began to clap, softly at first, then louder. Others joined in, a ripple of applause spreading through the room. They weren't just clapping for Jane. They were clapping for the sheer audacity, the brilliant, quiet defiance of the individual against the faceless bureaucracy. They were clapping for the unexpected triumph of nature over sterile conformity. Brenda Albright's face was beet red, a mixture of fury and utter humiliation. She stammered, trying to regain control. This is an unprecedented situation. The board, we need time to review this information." Her voice cracked. Her carefully constructed image of authority was crumbling before everyone's eyes. Mr. Peterson, clearing his throat awkwardly, spoke up, addressing the room but clearly directing his words at Brenda. Indeed, Ms. Miller's presentation raises significant legal implications that require immediate and thorough review by the board and our legal counsel. It appears we may have been operating under incomplete information. The thinly veiled accusation against Brenda's leadership was palpable. The vote to initiate legal action was quietly, almost shamefully, withdrawn. The rest of the meeting was a blur of hurried motions and uncomfortable silence from the board. As the meeting adjourned, people swarmed Jane, shaking her hand, offering congratulations. "That was brilliant," one shouted. "You really showed them," another exclaimed. Jane smiled, a genuine, radiant smile. She hadn't sought out conflict, but when it came, she had faced it with grace, intelligence, and the undeniable power of nature. Her ugly garden had not only survived, it had become a symbol of defiance, a beacon of biodiversity, and, most satisfyingly, the ultimate legal trap for the overzealous Sterling Meadows HOA. The aftermath of the HOA meeting was a quiet, almost anticlimactic period, but the tension had been decisively broken. Within a week, a formal letter arrived from the Sterling Meadows HOA. It wasn't signed by Brenda Albright, but by Mr. Peterson, the more pragmatic board member. The letter was terse, devoid of the usual condescending jargon, and painfully formal. It stated, in no uncertain terms, that all violation notices issued to 47 Maple Drive were officially rescinded. Furthermore, all fines were waived, and a new addendum to the HOA covenants was being drafted to clarify language regarding ecologically significant landscapes. It was a complete, unconditional surrender. Jane didn't gloat. She simply filed the letter with the others, another testament to the quiet power of knowledge. The triumph wasn't marked by fanfare or grand pronouncements. It was evident in the subtle shifts within Sterling Meadows. Brenda Albright became noticeably less visible at community events, her once commanding presence now reduced to hurried entrances and exits. Mr. Henderson, the sniffy board member, avoided eye contact with Jane whenever their paths crossed. The power dynamic had irrevocably shifted. The HOA, once an unyielding monolith of conformity, now moved with a new, almost hesitant caution. Meanwhile, Jane's native species sanctuary flourished, becoming a living testament to her victory. The initial ugly garden had matured into a vibrant, interconnected ecosystem. Where once there was only sterile lawn, now stood a lush tapestry of life. The milkweed plants, having reached their full height, were constantly abuzz with monarch butterflies, their orange and black wings a dazzling spectacle against the green. Swallowtails danced around the cone flowers, while hummingbirds zipped between the cardinal flowers, their tiny wings a blur. The gentle hum of thousands of bees, native and honeybees alike, was a constant, soothing soundtrack. Birdsong filled the air from dawn till dusk. The cheerful chirps of sparrows, the distinctive calls of robins, and the flash of blue as a jay darted through the taller grasses. Jane would spend hours observing, a sense of deep satisfaction settling over her. She'd see a rabbit nibbling at a clover patch, a chameleon blending seamlessly into the foliage, or a ladybug meticulously traversing a leaf. Every new species, every thriving plant was a quiet victory, a small act of healing for the environment. The garden wasn't just beautiful, it was functional, a vital link in the local food web, a small but significant contribution to biodiversity in a world increasingly dominated by monocultures. The most profound impact, however, was on the community itself. Initially, curiosity drew people to Jane's garden. Neighbors would slow their cars, children would point, and some brave souls would even stop to ask questions. Jane, no longer feeling defensive, happily shared her knowledge. She explained the importance of native plants, how they required less water and no harmful pesticides, and how they supported local wildlife. She taught them about the life cycle of the monarch butterfly, showing them the tiny eggs on the milkweed leaves, the voracious caterpillars, and, finally, the miraculous chrysalis. Slowly, hesitantly at first, other residents began to change, their own small patches of green. Mrs. Gable, the woman who had first applauded at the HOA meeting, was one of the first. She started with a small patch of coneflowers in her front yard, replacing a barren rose bush. Then came Mr. Davies, an older gentleman who replaced a portion of his lawn with a patch of native grasses, explaining to Jane that he was tired of mowing anyway. Community groups began to form, sharing native seeds and advice. A nascent green movement, sparked by one woman's defiance, was quietly taking root in Sterling Meadows. Jane's garden became an unofficial community landmark, a quiet revolution in green. People would ask her for advice, sharing stories of the new butterflies they saw in their own fledgling native patches. There was a sense of pride in these small acts of environmental stewardship, a newfound appreciation for the wild beauty that had been suppressed for so long. The sterile uniformity that the HOA so desperately clung to began to recede, replaced by pockets of vibrant life, a mosaic of personal sanctuaries. In the end, Jane didn't just win a battle against an oppressive HOA, she catalyzed a small, quiet change in her community's mindset. Her ugly garden wasn't just tolerated, it was celebrated, admired, and imitated. As she sat on her porch swing, watching the setting sun paint the sky over her flourishing sanctuary, she knew that the fight had been worth every moment. Her garden was more than just plants. It was a symbol of resilience, a testament to the power of one person to make a difference, and a vibrant, living legacy for both nature and the community she had quietly, beautifully transformed.